This podcast is brought to you by Most Valuable Podcasts, leading the league in podcasting entertainment.
What's up, real MVPs? Ricky Widmer here, along with the one, the only, Brandon Swanson.
Hey.
And we are back for another edition of the Primetime Podcast right here on Most Valuable Podcast, your one-stop shop for college sports, mainly college basketball and college football. And Brandon, it's finally begun. We are 1 week, well, not completely. We record this on Monday, so this week's the weird one. We still got one game left tonight, Virginia Tech and Florida State. But week one is in the books for most teams. It's great to see football back on the docket, and because of that, we got a jam-packed show. Going to get into those topics into a bit before. Going to give you a little bit of housekeeping. Number one, check out patreon.com/mostvaluablepodcast. Going to have Matt on in a little bit for this first segment, so you can be like him if you check out that down below. You can also get our t-shirt down below into the shop. Looks great. Black t-shirt, MVP logo. You also get it at mostvaluablepodcast.com, where you can catch MVP each and every day. And last but not least, I didn't check, but I'm assuming we're a couple of good old boys still, Brandon, and that's the only review on iTunes. Make sure to go over to iTunes and Apple Podcasts. If you could please give us a 5-star rating. It would mean the world to us, and then let us know how we're not a couple of good old boys, because we are talking SEC today, but we're not really talking SEC all the podcast, so I wouldn't say we're a couple of good old boys, but that's where you guys come in and let people know why we are not. But we got a jam-packed show looking at Notre Dame, Michigan from this past week. How does it shape the college football playoff picture? We're going to look at LSU after their stomping of the Miami Hurricanes in last night's thriller in their opening game. And then we're going to take a look ahead to Clemson and Texas A&M if an upset could be brewing in week 2. And then we will end the podcast making our week 2 picks. But we're going to welcome on for this first topic for Michigan and Notre Dame. Got to welcome in one of our loyal patrons, Matthew. And Matt, the first question I'm just going to ask you real plain and simple, along with how you're doing, is you're doing okay after that Purdue game, right? You're doing okay after that tough loss to Northwestern?
Yeah, I'm hanging in there. I had the opportunity to witness it in person, and it was a fun atmosphere, cool way to kick off the college football season. Obviously a little frustrating in the end, but the season isn't lost. There's still a lot to be played, and they hung tough with a pretty good Northwestern team. So we'll just have to recover from there.
Well, and like we were talking about before we hit the record button, the thing that I had asked you was if you were upset, because I know I was upset watching how that game ended, because I'm a kind of guy, I like things to be ended on the field. If it was a long pass breakup that ended the game, that's fine, but when it's a penalty and a, to me, dumb mistake, that's where it just gets my blood boiling. But let's look at the game that we're going to talk about now in Michigan, Notre Dame, where the Wolverines go into South Bend. And this was a game, Brandon, that you and I had talked about. We previewed the Fighting Irish. There were Fighting Irish fans that were really, I'm going to say me more than you, because I've been the most down on Notre Dame this offseason. But the Fighting Irish get the win 24-17. Shea Patterson didn't have his best game. I know he came out of the game. You had Dylan McCaffrey come in for a little bit, and it looked like they were getting Shea Patterson an IV in the locker room to get him back out, and he did finish the game. Brandon Wimbush looked great for the Fighting Irish. The defense looked amazing for this Fighting Irish team. Matt, I'm going to go to you first. Starting with Notre Dame, how do you think this win, what are you thinking of Notre Dame right now, and how is this going to shape the playoff picture for Notre Dame getting a win over the Wolverines?
So I guess I should just be frank and upfront in that I'm not a huge Notre Dame person, go figure. But no, I thought I didn't see the whole thing, but from what I did see, I thought that they did perform fairly well. I thought they really came out and punched Michigan right out of the get-go, and that kind of set the tone. And then I think you saw a lot of positives, both offensively and defensively from them. So to get that win, especially at home, underdogs, which I kind of surprised me, but to get that win over what's supposed to be a good Michigan team is obviously a good way to start off the season.
I think that for Notre Dame, what it did on Saturday night, it proved to people that it's okay that Quentin Nelson and Mike McGlinchey moved on to the NFL. They're going to be okay. They're going to be all right. Brandon Wimbush had time to throw. Armstrong had lanes to run through. I mean, he specifically talked about being able, I think on his 13-yard scamper to the end zone, said, it's really these guys doing it up front that are allowing me to do this. And that's going to continue, I would like to think, throughout the year. Again, you start off a test against what is supposed to be an improved Michigan team and a pretty darn good Michigan defense that we saw last year. I think that Notre Dame withstood a pretty good test and finishing it off by recovering that fumble in the final minute of the game. That was a huge thing defensively for Notre Dame. But I think that this Notre Dame team is going to be good going down the stretch. But if you want to talk about playoff hopes and outlooks and things like that, people were already putting Notre Dame, and I do like Notre Dame. They were already putting Notre Dame in their early season playoff picture. I don't necessarily want to say that you can do that right away, because if you were just putting every team in the top 25 that won their first game and putting them into the playoff picture, I mean, that would be kind of silly. So you look at Notre Dame winning, that's great. They start off on a better foot than what Michigan's going to, but you look at what Notre Dame's got kind of the rest of the way. They're going to have what should be an easy game this week against Ball State, but then you've got coming up soon, right at the end of September, you've got Stanford at home, then on the road at Virginia Tech. Then you've got a couple of weeks with Pittsburgh Navy at Northwestern, and clearly they're no slouch of a team. And then you come home against Florida State, you end on the road at USC. So you still have a number of tests if you're Notre Dame. And they're in a better position than Michigan is because they got the win here in week 1. But I still think that there's a lot for Notre Dame to have coming their way, but week 1 getting that win against Michigan, I think they look good and they start off on a good foot.
Well, and the thing that I was looking at when you and I previewed Notre Dame was basically all the tough matchups that they had, where it was you got Michigan to start, you get a team like Stanford who's 13th ranked before the new rankings come out tomorrow, Virginia Tech top 20 team, Florida State top 20 team, and then you have USC, that's a top 15 team. And the thing that I want to point out to people is some people might say, well, like, for example, Stanford and USC, those could be winnable games because, USC was playing UNLV and they only led 19-14 going into the half. And then San Diego State and Stanford was only a 9-7 game for the Cardinal heading into halftime. A lot of this first week of the season is second half adjustments. Like when it comes to the first half, most of those games, the two that I mentioned, ended up being 31-10 for Stanford. They just turned it on in the second half. Same thing for the Trojans. All 24 of their second half points coming in the fourth quarter, but they then blew out the Rebels 43-21. So a lot of these teams take it with a grain of salt because it's a lot of seeing what we got, kind of using that first half as kind of a buffer, and then boom, off to the races. Usually they find it and they make those adjustments at halftime. But I will say, based off of what I've seen from Notre Dame in game 1, and I know it's only one game and this is where we make our kind of overreactions for the season. We really overreact to week 1 no matter what season it is. But now I look at these games and there's some of them like maybe Stanford. All right. If that defense shows up to what it did right now, maybe that's a winnable game. Now, Florida State and Virginia Tech, we have technically, as we're recording this, have not seen them play as they play tonight. But depending on how those teams work, maybe those turn into winnable games. Northwestern, to me, yeah, that's going to be on the road at Northwestern, but I feel like the Northwestern team we saw in week 1, if that went up against the Notre Dame defense, that Notre Dame team, that maybe Notre Dame wins that game now, and then USC, I'm going to say that one's still going to be tough because it's in the Coliseum. If that one was in South Bend, I would be favoring the Irish at this point. I'm not on the side of, hey, let's put them in the playoffs. Oh, they're going to win every game. But there's a little bit of me is a little bit more favorable in the sense of, hey, you know what? maybe they have a better chance to win these games. Maybe some of these that I thought were going to be for sure losses, maybe those turn into kind of possibilities to win. And Matt, I'm going to go with you and ask you this. I'm just going to look at the ranked ones right now. Stanford, Virginia Tech, Florida State, USC. We'll even throw Northwestern in there because that's one of the prime teams that they're playing. Do you think, would you be more on the, hey, let's not overreact to week one? Or are you looking at it going, hey, you know what? Maybe they now become more favorable in these games because of what we saw against Michigan?
I'd probably go with a little bit of both. I mean, I think you saw a lot of positives, and I think for that reason, and just looking at those opponents, that you could say, yeah, there's reason to think that they can win those games, or at least, you know, that be toss-ups or something like that. However, I mean, I guess even if you look kind of back to Notre Dame last year, right, they were kind of, I think, maybe even in a similar situation out of the gate there, where they got off to a good start, but then just, you know, had a couple of losses down the road that knocked them out of the playoff. I guess Notre Dame becomes a unique situation, especially with them not being in the conference, right? The whole conference championship thing comes into play with them. So I think with them, I mean, they really do kind of have to run the table, or at least a little more is expected of them for that reason. So as far as playoff implications go, I think, you know, I hear those games and not having seen everyone played, but I think they certainly have a chance to run the table now, and that doesn't seem too crazy, but I think we need to see a little more too than just week one to make that judgment.
You're definitely always going to have to look at more than week one. That is usually not the best indicator of what the rest of the season could be, as we've seen in the past. But moving over to Michigan and moving over to the Big Ten East, the top dogs in the Big Ten East certainly did not look like top dogs this past weekend. Penn State barely skates by Appalachian State in overtime. And Michigan State barely skates by in their game, 38-31.
Against Utah State.
Ohio State, you shouldn't be excited that you scored 77 points. You played Oregon State. You should be more worried that you gave up 31 points. And then
I'm going to fight you on that one a little bit. The only thing I'm going to say is be excited for that 77 because of how the offense looked, although I will agree with you that the 31 to Oregon State is too high. But the offense for Ohio State looked in mid-season form.
But don't be excited. It's Oregon State, so calm down. But then the thing that I would say, Matt, is then if you look at Michigan's schedule now, they're going to be going through a couple of games coming up. They're going to be going against the teams that I think are going to be interesting, which are most of them. Nebraska. If you talk to Nebraska fans, they think that they're going to win like most games this season, which I think is a little over the top, but they're going to be certainly moving and I think the right direction. On the road at Northwestern will be a tough game. Maryland could be a tough game because of how they played Texas in week one. Then you've got Wisconsin. Wisconsin is going to be very good. But then you got on the road at Michigan State and home against Penn State. Now, those games before this week, I would have said, those are in my opinion, they're most likely going to be losses for Michigan. But after the way that both Michigan State and Penn State played this last week, I would say Michigan has a definite fighting chance in both of those games. And then obviously the game on the road at Ohio State to end the season. And I won't even count out the Indiana game. So man, I want to throw it to you, and especially being the Big Ten buff that you are, looking at that, do you see a really tough road, possibly tumultuous road for Michigan, or do you think that this could be one where week one wasn't good, a lot of people are down on them, but they come out of the quote-unquote cellar and they actually surprise people throughout the year? What do you think?
I guess as far as Michigan goes, kind of using last year's results too, I'm kind of, low on them. I really don't think they lived up to expectations last year, and I think how they came out of the gate this year doesn't help to kind of change my mind. So I think looking at the schedule too, I mean, as far as their crossover games, as I'm sure you guys kind of hit on in the preview, I mean, they've got two of the tougher teams, and yes, they host Wisconsin, but Wisconsin obviously is a top 4 team, and then Northwestern as well, who's basically established themselves now as the second best team in the West. So having those 2 games too as your crossover certainly doesn't help an already brutal schedule being in the East. So I'm pretty concerned. I mean, I wouldn't put it past that if this really goes really bad, that they could be like a 500 type team. I don't think that will happen, but I could see a scenario where it would, and I think at that point Harbaugh is going to, if he's not already gone, he's going to be on the hottest coals available. So that's kind of where I'm at, I guess.
And that's, I just really quickly before Ricky takes off here, is that's what I wanted to make mention to as well. Is not that I don't want to say that Michigan is going to be a crummy team throughout the rest of the season. I'm not going to say that, but let's say that they do really struggle. Let's say that they're only a game or 2 over 500. Michigan fans who after listening to Ricky and I talk about if Harbaugh does not win this year, and I'm not talking win it all, go to the national championship game or anything, but if he doesn't win the East, if he doesn't make the playoffs, if they don't show progress from last year's down year, will he be on the hot seat? And I said yes. And then fans, of course, ripped me and ripped Ricky and I, and said the only way that Harbaugh is on the hot seat is if they go 0-12. And now, yeah, I mean, you'd really be on a hot seat if you go 0-12, but also at the same time, is he? Because Michigan, and this is just me thinking in the last couple of weeks, and certainly after this game, is who better would Michigan be going after? I mean, a lot of the really good head coaches now, they got scooped up and signed to long-term deals this past season. And now they're with their respective teams. Jimbo Fisher's going to be, of course, over at Texas A&M for 10 years, right? Because we all know that he'll end his career there, but unless some other good deal comes along. But who else would they go with? So right now it's almost they continue to ride Harbaugh out and just let him figure it out because they know what kind of recruiter he is and everything like that. So Matt, just going, back to that, even if he is on the hot seat, do you think they would even look to, if he's on the media hot seat, is he really on the school's hot seat?
Yeah, I mean you're right. I think that always needs to be considered, sort of if we got rid of him, what better could we do, sort of situation. I think too many times that's not taken into account, and there's sort of this too quick of a reaction to want to get rid of the guy without any forward thinking on, are we actually going to get any better? So no, that's definitely a valid point. But I don't know. I guess I'm not a Michigan fan, but just knowing the expectations that come with that program, it seems to me like the way he struggled in the big game so far, I thought I saw a graphic that maybe he's like 3-6 versus, some of the upper tier teams in the Big Ten East. That's not going to cut it. And I mean, at what point do you draw that line and say enough is enough and that we're not going to accept that? I don't know. Maybe that's not this year. Maybe it is. But I think at some point they're kidding themselves if they say that they're going to be happy with the results that have been produced at this point.
Well, it's like the first thing I looked at when you pull up the ESPN page for Michigan is there was a little bit of, I guess they were talking to Paul Feinbaum today, and the quote just goes, Feinbaum, Harbaugh wasn't brought to Michigan to lose to ND. And I've gone through just Harbaugh's seasons with Michigan. So year 1, and I'm just doing rivals, by the way. Year 1, Michigan State, Ohio State, he's 0-2. The next year, he's 0-2. So now he's 0-4. After that third year, he beats Michigan State, but loses to Ohio State. He's now 1-5.
And wasn't that Michigan State team a 3-9 Michigan State team?
I believe so, yeah. Yes. So he is now, what would that be, 1-5. Then last year, loses to Michigan State in Ann Arbor, loses to Ohio State in Ann Arbor, 1-8. Now you tack on the week 1 loss. He is 1-9. 1-9 against rivals at Michigan. And you can say whatever you want with the, oh, well, Jim Harbaugh has a good record at Michigan. He's 28-12 at Michigan. He's 18-8 in the conference. He's got a winning record. But here's the ultimate thing that I think happens. And this week 1 loss doesn't hurt Michigan's chances in the Big Ten, because I think that Matt hit a good point with Notre Dame that can be flipped on the Michigan side. If they play well in the Big Ten and they win the Big Ten, and let's say this is the only loss at the end of the year, we will be sitting here looking at them as a playoff team, especially if, let's say, Notre Dame, if they go undefeated and Michigan only has this 1 loss, then the committee, the big argument will be, yeah, they have a 1 loss, but Notre Dame, they're an undefeated team. They're a playoff team, so can you really hold it against them? Or let's say they lose in like the title game. And one of the big things, I know I was talking to Dave on Friday, and he was like, oh, in college football, I think we're going to get 2 teams from the Big Ten in the playoff. Where I'm like, I don't know. I would put my money on the SEC getting 2 in over the Big Ten. But my biggest problem with the whole Harbaugh debate and conversation right now is if I had to look into my crystal ball, and I'm not saying it's going to be this year, I'm not saying it's going to be next year, based off of what I have seen, the same thing will happen to Harbaugh, which happened to Lovie Smith and the Bears. The only difference, Lovie Smith came in with Chicago and was really good against the rival. He came in and said, we're going to beat the Packers. And at first he did. The Bears were starting to beat the Packers, and it felt nice for Bears fans. But then you look at his last 4 seasons, only 1 win against the Packers. And when the Bears fired him, I believe it was a 10-6 it was a 10-6 season, but they cited, you can't beat the Packers, and we got to beat the Packers. This team is going nowhere. I feel like Jim Harbaugh, not this year, maybe not next year, maybe the year after, it'll be, yeah, you're an 8 to 10 win coach, but if you can't beat the Notre Dames, if you can't beat the Michigan States, if you can't beat the Ohio States, that is eventually going to sit in the craw of the Board of Trustees, alumni, current students, to where it's like, I don't care if we're winning 10 games a year. We're not in the playoff discussion because we can't beat Michigan State. We can't beat Ohio State. And even if we could, we can't beat Notre Dame. And that's just going to irritate this fan base eventually, in my mind.
I think the biggest thing for Michigan right now, bigger than even thinking about what could happen with Harbaugh, are they set with Shea Patterson as their starting quarterback?
Yes.
That's the number one thing moving forward. Mm-hmm. Is he going to, is this what Michigan's going to get from Shea Patterson throughout the season? And the answer that most Michigan fans would say is no, absolutely not. But he has got to feel more comfortable than he did last week, especially if he's going up against good defenses. He's going to have to feel comfortable. He's going to have to be able to make some of the good passes and the tough passes and complete them and make some of the big plays. Those were things that he wasn't able to have on Saturday night. There were no big plays.
There were a few, but they weren't
I'm talking about like what lead to points. I mean, what ultimately leads to points and leads to wins. And that's just not necessarily what he was able to do.
And for me, I look at Matt, before I go back to you, the thing that's a good thing is, like, first when you ask that question, Brandon, are they set with Shea Patterson? I'm going to be honest. Get that stuff out of the studio. We are not having a quarterback debate here on the podcast. Shea Patterson will be the starting quarterback unless he's injured for the entire year at Michigan. The good thing, though, that I look at is, like, you mentioned Nebraska. Well, we can't overreact to Nebraska because I guess that their game got canceled on Saturday. Akron didn't want to play on Sunday, so the game just got canceled. We'll wait to see what they do in their first game this upcoming week. But, I mean, they got Michigan as Nebraska as their first Big Ten conference game, and then immediately after Northwestern, Maryland, who played well against Texas. Matt Canada, I think, is going to do good things with Maryland, and then they've got Wisconsin, Michigan State, Penn State. Everyone coming into week one, into Saturday night's game, was like, Michigan's got the hardest schedule. They got the hardest schedule. But the good thing for me is we will see Shea Patterson improve because they've got Western Michigan coming up next. They got SMU after that. If they lose any of those two games, light the season on fire. Let's look to next year. But I feel like these two games will be ones where, all right, Shea Patterson can get into a rhythm because, like, when you're playing in practice, it's a lot different than playing into a game. And when you're a transfer coming into Michigan, all the pressure on the offseason that we've put on Shea Patterson's shoulders of, like, oh, the first good quarterback that Jim Harbaugh has had, he's going to be the reason Jim Harbaugh can get to the college football playoff. It puts a lot of pressure on you, and then you got to go up and play Notre Dame in Notre Dame. So I'm looking at it as, let's see these next two against lesser opponents and see if they can build off of, because there were good things from Shea Patterson in that game. They had one big long pass in the first half that I really liked, but there were times where it's like, oh, the pressure's coming, Shea Patterson gets it out quick. And if he can do that more, he'll be successful. Matt, I guess what I'm going to ask you is, when it comes to that Nebraska game, is because we're saying that there's a possibility that Nebraska could be a better team this year with Scott Frost, do you think we'll see improvement from Shea Patterson in the next two games before Michigan hits conference play on September 22nd?
Yeah, I would suspect so. I mean, obviously we would expect that Notre Dame's defense is probably a heck of a lot better than the next two defenses he's going to play. So for that reason alone, yeah, I think you should see better numbers, and if you don't, then there should be concern there. As far as his performance on Saturday against Notre Dame, I mean, I think he looked all right. The numbers indicate that he did okay, but to kind of the Brandon's point, as far as, you know, leading the points, I mean, Michigan, I mean, let's not forget that Michigan had a kickoff return for a touchdown that accounted for 7 of those points, right? So, I mean, they really had 3 points until, pretty late into the fourth quarter, at least offensively, directly from the offense. So I think that is still a little bit concerning. But, yeah, let's see how the offense progresses through these next 2 weeks, and then maybe that gives them the boost they need in the confidence to get everything clicking by conference schedule season.
And Brandon, before I ask you your final thoughts, before we move on, I want to ask you this question. When it comes to the putting points on the board, because that's important, you got to put points on the board to win the game.
Is that
Boom.
How you win?
Thanks, John Madden. But is that more of a Shea Patterson? Like, or should we put the fault for that on Shea Patterson or Jim Harbaugh? Is it a scheme thing and the offense not being able? Was it not calling the right plays, putting Shea Patterson in the right situation, or just Shea Patterson not being able to make the plays with the plays that were called from Jim Harbaugh on the sidelines?
Well, when you first asked the question, I was going to give the smart-ass answer of, well, Jim Harbaugh's not on the field, so obviously it would be Shea Patterson. I think it's more on Shea Patterson. We know what he can do. I mean, he needs to be Ole Miss Shea Patterson. That's who Michigan was excited to be getting. Someone who is very capable, has a good arm, is an accurate passer, and can really heave the deep ball, and it leads to points. That's what Shea Patterson needs to be able to do. And when your offense really, and again, I don't want to take away anything from Notre Dame's defense and say that it was all Shea Patterson struggling on his own. Notre Dame's defense was very good. I mean, they had a lot of stops. They had a lot of key stops. They did a great job on Saturday. Notre Dame's defense did. But again, Shea Patterson, if he's this quarterback that a lot of people are and we're expecting, he has got to rise above all of that, and he's got to be better. That's exactly what has to happen. He just has to flat out be better. These next two games should give him the opportunity to do that because they're going to be lesser defenses than what Notre Dame was. Mm-hmm. But hopefully he'll be able to figure it out in those two games because I think that once it gets into the conference, there really will not be an easy game.
Well, and Matt, I'll ask you, what are your final thoughts on this to kind of put a final bow on both Michigan and Notre Dame?
So I think Notre Dame, obviously getting that win, it's kind of a resume builder, or at least you're hoping it is. So I think it's definitely a good start for them as they, especially, in terms of looking into playoff contention. So I think that got them off on the right foot. And as far as Michigan, your season isn't lost. There's reason for concern, even though it is early, but there's also opportunity to kind of correct some of that, and you've got enough worthy opponents on your schedule that you don't necessarily need to think the playoffs out of the picture if you can run the table and get to the conference championship and such. So not all is lost, but definitely need to see some improvement here in the coming weeks.
Yeah, and I mean, the last thing I'll say is kind of to go off the question that I had asked you, Brandon, is I'm going to say it's a little bit of column A, column B, but I'm putting more of that, a little bit more of the chips into that column B, which would be the Jim Harbaugh, because the only reason why is, yes, we should have expected some struggle from Shea Patterson. First time he's being in this offense in a real game, and that defense for Notre Dame, like you said, let's not take away anything from them because they were phenomenal in that first game. Like, watching it, my biggest takeaway after watching the first few plays was like, all right, that coach we talked about when we were talking about new DC and Notre Dame, all right, that really paid off. Good salary that you paid him for this game. But I mean, when I look back to the Notre Dame game now and all of Michigan State's losses last year, South Carolina, Ohio State, Wisconsin, Penn State, Michigan State. The most points that they scored in any of those games, including the one this week, 20. They had 10 against Michigan State, 13 against Penn State, 10 against Wisconsin, 20 against Ohio State, but maybe they played up a little bit for that one, and then 19 against the Gamecocks in their bowl game. Part of me is wondering if it's Shea Patterson's fault points weren't being put on the board, or if Jim Harbaugh and this team, if it's just like they go up against good teams and Jim Harbaugh with the play calling and the coaching staff kind of shit the bed a little bit. So, I mean, I think I'm not taking all the pressure off of and all the blame off of Shea Patterson.
You're trying.
But I think it's both column A, column B. Like, let's not be like, oh, Jim Harbaugh had nothing to do with this.
True, but a lot of it is about execution. I mean, I think most sports people know that, and most players know that it's about execution. I mean, there's a lot of schemes that you can have work, and it's just about the execution of those schemes and having the right players fit for those schemes. And so that's what I think.
And the thing I would just say to combat that's kind of like the devil's advocate is, yeah, you have to execute on the field, which is the players, but the coaches have to put their players in the best situations and call the best plays that they think will have those shine. This is where I want to pass that question off to you guys, though, is, first off, what do you think with like Notre Dame, Michigan State, and the playoff picture? But kind of this last question of like with Michigan's troubles, is it Shea Patterson's fault? Is it Jim Harbaugh's fault? What is Jim Harbaugh's future going to be if this season isn't a good year for Michigan? Michigan fans, how are you feeling after game one? Notre Dame fans, how are you feeling after game one? Let us know down below in that comment section.